Hi everyone, welcome to this session. Thanks so much for tuning in. My name is Anjali Lai. I am a senior analyst at Forrester Research, and I lead the firm's research into consumer behavior, consumer decision making. This session, we are talking about getting to know Generation Z. Who is this generation? How do they shop? What makes them tick? And how can you reach these consumers more effectively moving forward? I'm really excited for this session because I'll share some of the latest data, quantitative, qualitative insight that we've been collecting at Forrester through our own research as well as our third-party vendors. And really, I'm using this latest thinking to tell the story about what makes this generation unique and how you can connect with them moving forward. So let's first talk about who is Gen Z, then we'll talk about how they shop. There's a lot of news about this generation, certainly. You must have been reading articles, you must have been hearing about the sort of buzz around this particular cohort. And in my research, I found that there is a lot of sort of mythology around this particular consumer cohort. There's some kind of assumptions that we have about these young consumers that don't necessarily hold up when we look at the data. So in this presentation, I'll be sharing a lot of the data points and insights with you so that we can sort of bust some of those myths and understand the truth about this particular generational cohort. So let's start by talking about how we really define Gen Z. What are we actually talking about? Generation Z are the consumers that are born between 1997 and 2012, so they're somewhere between 10 to 25 years old today. And if you look at it in the distribution of the total US population, you'll see that Generation Y, or commonly known as millennials, make up 22% of the US consumer base. They are today the largest generation. That's followed by the boomers, who are born between 1946 to 1964. They make up about 21% of the US population. And then third in line is Generation Z. Now, millennials just sort of eclipsed boomers as the largest generation in the US a couple of years ago. And now Gen Z, as you can tell from this data, is right on the heels of millennials. So over the course of the next decade, we'll see Generation Z kind of growing into their own as consumers, also as employees. As they build their careers, they will grow in spending power and in force and in sort of the presence that they have in the market. Today, Generation Z represents about $143 billion in spending power. They are sort of most likely to rebound in their spending habits following the pandemic. Many studies have shown that they're spending faster than their older generational counterparts, partially because they're still living with family and friends and are supported in that sense. But this represents a huge opportunity, not only because they are growing as consumers, but also because they wield tremendous influence over, for example, their Generation X parents and other peers. So let's dive in to understand what exactly makes this generation unique, because of course generations aren't only defined by data points or statistics and the years of birth, they're also shaped by the context, the economic, political, social environment in which the generation is growing up. Generation Z is unique because these consumers are essentially growing up in the aftermath of the Iraq War, of 9/11. They are coming of age during the great financial crisis, a time of extreme political polarization in the US, not to mention the global pandemic. And so these events really are shaping Gen Z values and Gen Z's outlook on brand and how to sort of live their lives and build their career. When it comes to family structure, Gen Z is still typically often living with parents, living with family and friends. They are less likely to be owning a home than millennials or Gen Y as of right now. But they are also growing up in a digital world. So you can sort of think of their devices as a kind of their own version of home. They're finding their place in their digital space. Gen Z consumers are also distinct in that they are highly driven by social values. They are looking for jobs that create impact. They're driven by a sense of purpose, and they're taking this mindset to the workplace. As they think about entering the workplace and building their career, they particularly want to have a larger impact than some of the consumers in the generations before them. And all of this kind of background and context shapes the values that Gen Z really cares about. They are highly tuned to social issues. They are highly tuned to issues of the environment, things like climate change. And this is driving not only how they interact with their peers and their colleagues, but also percolates into their brand choices and brand perceptions and how they select particular products to try and then also to stay loyal to. There's a really interesting tension in Generation Z as well, which is that on the one hand, they are growing up in this digital world. Gen Z consumers don't know what life is like without a mobile phone or without a computer. They don't know what it's like to not have any kind of digital identity or sort of presence in the digital space. But on the other hand, Gen Z consumers are also aware of the slew of data breaches that have been happening in recent years. They know about the corporate scandals, political scandals. They also realize the limitations of their devices and technology. They are among the most socially isolated generation, and they realize that digital relationships don't necessarily carry the same weight or emotional value as interpersonal physical relationships. And for this reason, their digital communication patterns look very different from millennials and other preceding generations. For instance, Generation Z adopts a fairly casual tone when interacting and communicating online. They typically opt for private messaging, so they opt for encrypted messaging systems. They opt for talking to peers and friends behind closed doors in the digital space, and they're highly visual and sensory in their communication preferences when it comes to the digital world. One final important thing to know about Generation Z is that this cohort is the most diverse, racially and ethnically speaking, relative to any of the previous generations. So you can see from the data on this slide that 52% of Generation Z is considered white or Caucasian. That's the smallest percentage out of any of the other generations. We've just crossed the tipping point in the US where the more non-white children were born than white children. And so therefore, this idea of diversity and inclusion is not really a distant future. It's already here and it's already happening. And we'll see this playing out much more in a much more overt way over the coming years throughout the decade. So we've talked about this generation, how to define them, what makes them unique, what shaped their values and their attitudes. So let's get into how they shop. How do they make decisions about which brands to partner with, which products to experiment with? In this section, I'll share with you 4 different motivating factors that are driving Gen Z consumers toward certain brand experiences. I'll explain the factor, I'll kind of illustrate it using an example of a small business. And then I'll close with a few tangible recommendations that you can take as you shape your marketing and advertising content and tone to reach the rising generational cohort. The first motivating factor is uniqueness. Now you might say, yes, we've heard about Gen Z sort of resisting labels and constructs and categories and trying to be individual and unique in their own way, but we've also seen so much evidence that they still jump on the bandwagon of certain trends and create subcultures. I mean, you can look at TikTok and you know, that's a great example of this. Yes, while it is true that they jump on the bandwagon, they do partake in trends, they have driven so much content to sort of go viral, and it looks like they have this kind of conformist behavior. What's different about this generation is that they join trends in order to put their own unique spin on a particular trend or behavior. This generation is highly interested in being creative. They're highly interested in self-expression and kind of showing and also creating their individuality and their individual voice. One brand that has leaned into this sentiment heavily is a brand called Starface, which is sort of a skincare brand particularly aimed at treating acne and other kind of skin conditions. And Starface sells these what they call hydro stars, which are sort of like, patches or stickers that you can place on different affected areas of the skin where you have acne or another kind of condition. And unlike other products that do the same kind of thing, that are typically sheer or try to sort of blend into the skin, Starface specifically makes these stickers colorful, bright. It draws attention to the individual and sort of what's happening on his or her face at that time, and in this way kind of liberates the conversation around something like acne or something like a skincare condition and changes the entire narrative about that experience. Starface sells these hydro stars in a little kind of yellow box with a smiley face that you see pictured here that is affectionately known as Big Yellow, which has kind of become the animating personality of the brand and becomes the voice through which the brand communicates with its consumers. Starface also, interestingly, makes sure to include pictures of real consumers who actually use the product and who are in the brand community in all of the marketing and advertising content. And in this way, they create a real sort of dialogue and genuine sense of community around this brand and, again, encourage that kind of individuality and self-expression. So individuality, uniqueness, creativity is a big theme for Generation Z, and you see this playing out in their online behaviors. This is one of the reasons why TikTok has gained so much momentum among this young generational cohort, even throughout the pandemic when short-form video was really struggling. TikTok took off because it invited consumers to get creative around certain trends. This is why TikTok has surpassed both Snapchat and Instagram to become the most popular social networking site among Generation Z, which it sort of crossed that tipping point in the past year. This is not only something that defines Gen Z behaviors among peers, this also translates into how Gen Z views their career and sort of how they think about priorities moving forward. 72% of Gen Z consumers would like to start a business someday, compared to 64% of millennials and young millennials specifically. So Gen Z consumers are much more likely to be taking classes in entrepreneurship. Current high school and young college students are likely to be seeking out opportunities for entrepreneurship. Gen Z consumers are highly familiar with the opportunities that technology offers to create lucrative business opportunities and to take control of their career in a way that is inherently creative and unique, and creates this sort of makes this space for self-expression moving forward. So what does this mean for you? Connect with consumers in the Gen Z cohort at the individual level. Because they're so sort of into this theme of uniqueness and self-expression, they're also receptive to that. There's room for you to tell your own story. Perhaps if you have an interesting, creative, entrepreneurial story, Gen Z consumers would want to hear that. They want to hear about the personal experience, kind of building up the brand. They use that kind of emotional, personal language to forge a sense of connection and to share the creativity in your own life and your own experience running the business. And then invite consumers to get creative with you. If there are perhaps options to customize certain products, or you can get creative with matching different kinds of product options. All of that kind of encourages Gen Z consumers to get creative as well, which draws them into the experience. And then embrace inclusivity in your marketing content and tone. In line with this idea that Gen Z consumers are the most racially and ethnically diverse, they also want to see that in the products that they're purchasing, whether it's about something related to the composition of your small business, or something about your own personal story, or the consumers that are using your products. Kind of show that variety and show that novelty and that opportunity for innovation and diversity in order to create this emotional connection with the Gen Z cohort. The second motivating factor is authenticity. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Gen Z consumers are highly aware of deep fakes, fake news. They have been exposed to the slew of corporate political scandals, and for this reason, they are among the most skeptical of all generations when it comes to their trust in business, in big government, and other sort of institutional entities. Gen Z consumers, for example, will say that they are least likely to trust even the big banks to keep their personal data secure. Only 30% of Gen Z consumers trust big banks to secure their personal data, compared to over half of US consumers on average. For this reason, Gen Z consumers are deeply attracted to brands that earn consumer trust by being authentic. Able Fashion is a great example of a small business that really sort of does this. Able Fashion has this goal of empowering women through fashion. And they do this by being transparent about what products they sell, what ingredients and materials are going into their product. They tell the story of the craftsmanship behind each product. They essentially give transparency into the whole supply chain. And with every product on the website, Able will publish a transparency scorecard that shows what exactly is going into that product and from where it was sourced. Kind of similar to a nutritional label on a food item. Able has this idea of kind of publishing a food nutrition label for the fashion space. And just like consumers will make smarter decisions about what they eat when they can see all of the details about what goes into their food, Able is hoping that consumers will be nudged to make decisions about what they wear, knowing what has gone into all of this. So this idea of transparency and showing especially the brand's values is core to showing this sense of authenticity. And Gen Z consumers expect this. More than 60% of Gen Z consumers believe that companies have an obligation to take the lead on climate change. Around 60% believe that businesses have an obligation to take a stand on diversity and inclusion. Even 4 in 10 Gen Z consumers believe that companies should lead political change. Gen Z wants to see that brands are being transparent and authentic about their values and are creating an avenue for consumers to also follow through on the values that they care about. And it's true, it actually translates into action. It's not just something that young consumers are asking for. 54% of Gen Z youth say that they have stopped using a brand because of ethics that they did not agree with. Over 50% of Gen Z consumers also have chosen brands specifically because of the values that the brand stands for. So this is percolating into the decision-making process and is driving actual brand selection behavior. And this is becoming much more powerful over time. This 54% number has grown over the past few years, and we've just crossed the tipping point where more than half of young consumers are also promoting brands that have the values that they agree with. And we expect this to continue becoming much more overt in the coming years. So when you are marketing or advertising your brand, your products online, be sure to portray pictures of real people and products in your digital content. Gen Z consumers will be able to notice if pictures are highly filtered or manipulated or staged in a particular way, and they're more responsive to the pictures that look real and feel like they are just sort of casual or authentic. Be clear about your own values, the values that you stand for that are related to your brand or to your product. And Gen Z consumers almost expect brands to, at some point, make some kind of mistake, even at a small scale. If it's like, for instance, sending the wrong product or having some sort of minor, misalignment of expectation in the delivery fulfillment process. But Gen Z consumers say that brands that acknowledge those mistakes are much more likely to be honest and authentic moving forward than the brands that don't. So if that were to happen, own up to mistakes, show accountability, and use this to earn trust through this sort of tone of honesty. The third motivating factor is community. Now, I mentioned earlier that Gen Z consumers are among the most socially isolated generational cohort, which means that they turn to brands as the sort of catalyst for community and for connection. Think about what happened in 2020 when all the schools went remote, education was online. What happened to those special kind of rituals that happen, for instance, at the end of the year before going off on summer vacation, like signing yearbooks? Enter a mobile app called Have a Great Summer, which partnered with Snapchat to allow consumers to sign each other's yearbooks virtually. They could customize these messages with emojis and icons and stickers and other kind of images. Individuals could get a printed sort of hard copy of their yearbook, and if they made any kind of purchase, all of the money would be donated to charities. This is an example of a brand using the digital resources to bring consumers together and make that sort of feeling of intimacy and connection immediate for these young consumers. So when I'm talking about community, I mean it in a very broad sense, and I mean it in all sort of meanings of the term, right? All variations of community that you can conceive of. For example, Gen Z consumers are most likely to turn to their peers, their fellow consumers when evaluating products, when choosing what to buy. Around half of Gen Z consumers regularly read peer reviews before making a purchase, compared to sort of 30% of US consumers on average. And Gen Z consumers say this. They told us, for example, I look to my social networks and ask for opinions about products and services before I buy them. I also ask if anyone has ordered from this particular site before. So Gen Z consumers are relying on their fellow consumers to sort of make collective decisions about what they purchase. But they also look to influencers or creators and the communities that these individuals build around them. Gen Z consumers, as you can see from this data, are more likely than any other cohort to look at creators to identify which products and brands to trust, to discover new brands and to discover new products, and also figure out what exactly to select, right? What to buy and where to put their money. So they're sort of building this community sense even among people they don't know personally, but have a relationship with in the digital space. All of this shapes how Gen Z consumers are willing to engage with others, even that are strangers, right? Other people they don't know. All of this leads me to say that Gen Z consumers are much more willing to engage in the sharing economy and the circular economy. They are much more likely to engage in rent and return models, for example, or even buy items on resale. Gen Z consumers are more likely than any sort of the US average to buy manufactured refurbished products, secondhand products, hand refurbished products, or pre-owned luxury, whether that's buying online or in the store. And when you look at this broadly, Gen Z consumers are much more likely than Gen X, Boomers, or Golden Generation to engage in sharing services across a variety of spaces, from travel to retail to fashion. So think about how your brand and your set of products can create a sense of community around your experience. Consider using emotional language to connect with consumers and show empathy for the shopper. That emotional connection automatically feels a little bit more intimate than, say, just advertising the functionality or sort of productive aspect of a particular item that you're selling. You can think about building the relationship even across channels. How do you engage with consumers not only online but offline? eBay Vault is a great example of something that provides an opportunity to dive into that more deeply. And then highlight the experiential element of the resale items. Individuals who are buying items through the circular economy aren't only drawn by the sort of productive nature and the functional benefits of that. They're also drawn by the impact of the environment or the social sort of aspect of that. So help the Gen Z consumers understand that by engaging in this kind of model, they are not only buying a particular product that has certain utility, they are contributing to their local community and participating in something larger than themselves. That drives home this feeling of community. Fourth and finally, the other motivating factor to be aware of is choice. So Function is one direct-to-consumer brand that has kind of taken over social media with its Instagrammable hair care products. And this particular company allows young consumers to take a quiz online to learn about their kind of hair styles. They can select up to 5 different hair care-related goals, anything from color protection to curl definition, and then consumers can select the scent of the product, the color of their choice, and the product will be built for them using sustainable and 100% vegan ingredients and inputs. This model essentially allows the consumer to customize the entire product from functionality to design. This is a little bit of an extreme example, but it shows the kind of experience that Gen Z consumers are really drawn by and really bought into at this point. Gen Z consumers want that choice, that variety, that optionality, not just in their products, but also in how they're living their lives. Gen Z consumers are least likely of all generations to be working from their desk in their employer's office. They're more likely to be working from home in addition to a variety of other locations. Gen Z consumers are looking for this variety and novelty throughout their life in terms of where they spend their time, also in terms of how they interact with brands. For example, Gen Z consumers, as well as millennials in this case, are more likely to engage with buy now and pay later options. This is something particularly to pay attention to as we're recovering from the pandemic and working through the next few years of economic turbulence. Young consumers are opting for these buy now, pay later, flexible kind of payment options during these months and moving forward. So think about how to demonstrate a sense of variety and novelty in your own experience. Are consumers using your products in interesting ways? Are there testimonials that kind of show how consumers have made your products work for them in really kind of creative and various ways or various modes? Highlight opportunities for customization for optionality. What sort of freedom do Gen Z consumers have, and how do you enable a sense of choice making or fluidity and variety in your offering? And then finally, make space for shoppers to get creative with you. Gen Z consumers, as we've talked about so far, want to express this sense of creativity, want to give feedback, want to hear that their feedback has been acknowledged. So listen to that empathetically, have that conversation with consumers, and this will give them the feeling of choice and being in control. Thank you very much for listening to this session. I hope this has given you some useful and intriguing insights into the rising cohort of Generation Z. Perhaps also raise some questions that will lead you to look into this generation more deeply. Stay tuned for further research that we will be publishing about this generation, and good luck and enjoy the rest of the event.